In the previous part of our detailed look at the Auburn Affirmation, we investigated the opening salvos of the historic modernist fundamentalist controversy within the Presbyterian Church in the USA. We explored how the conservative majority's 1923 mandate forcing all ministerial candidates to subscribe to 5 essential doctrines created an immediate existential crisis for progressive clergy. In response, these ministers drafted and circulated a brilliant legal and theological defense known as the Auburn Affirmation, successfully capturing the signatures of nearly 20% of the entire denomination. They achieved this massive institutional milestone by successfully rallying the moderate middle around the historic and democratic principle of local presbytery authority across the church infrastructure. Now the ecclesiastical pendulum swings back. Having seen how the affirmationists mobilized their defense, we turn our attention to the fierce pushback from the highly organized traditionalist ranks. We begin part 2 by examining the intellectual powerhouse of the conservative movement, whose devastating critique stripped away the diplomatic language of the Auburn Affirmation entirely. Machen unleashed this relentless public counterattack to expose what they firmly believed was a battle between 2 entirely different religions operating within the same denomination. The intellectual leader of the conservative resistance was J. Gresham Machen, a brilliant professor of New Testament at Princeton Theological Seminary, who launched a monumental defense. In his definitive 1923 book, Christianity and Liberalism, J. Gresham Machen rejected the narrative that the conflict was a mere minor internal disagreement among colleagues. Instead, J. Gresham Machen argued with absolute conviction that modernism represented a completely different religion altogether from the historic faith proclaimed by the church. J. Gresham Machen maintained the struggle was an irreconcilable conflict between supernatural Christianity and a naturalistic negation of the faith, raising an urgent warning for believers. He warned that the church's greatest danger came from an anti-Christian philosophy within its own ranks, rather than from any secular forces outside the institution. To J. Gresham Machen, the Auburn Affirmation was a manifesto of compromise obscuring this reality, acting as a deceptive shroud over the core issues at hand. To demonstrate this incompatibility, J. Gresham Machen outlined several deep theological contrasts spanning the entire spectrum of Christian doctrine from top to bottom. Regarding God, modernism presented a deity immanent and largely one with the world process, whereas historical Christianity worshipped a transcendent creator, independent of creation. For human nature, modernism operated with supreme confidence in human goodness, while historical orthodoxy declared a fallen, sinful nature in absolute need of rescue. Concerning authority, modernism elevated subjective Christian experience, whereas historical Christianity defended the objective authority of the entirely inerrant Holy Scriptures. Regarding Christ, modernism esteemed him as an inspiring example of human faith, while orthodoxy worshipped him as the God-man, the sole object of saving faith. Finally, for the cross, modernism reframed it as a moral example of self-sacrifice, whereas Orthodox theology held fast to it as a unique, objective, substitutionary sacrifice. Because these systems were incompatible, J. Gresham Machen believed they could not coexist within the same denomination, making an immediate formal and formal separation urgent. For J. Gresham Machen, this was a matter of institutional honesty. He maintained it was deeply unethical for ministers to occupy confessional pulpits while actively undermining established doctrines. Machen openly called it a dishonest misappropriation of resources provided by lay people who fully intended to support historical orthodoxy rather than its systematic erosion. The day after the Auburn Affirmation's release, J. Gresham Machen sent a blistering statement to the New York Times, which printed it alongside the Progressive Manifesto. J. Gresham Machen condemned the declaration as an attempt to cloud the controversy, drawing a sharp line between a redemptive religion and a naturalistic agnostic modernism. J. Gresham Machen accused the Affirmationists of destroying the church's corporate witness by interpreting the Westminster Confession in ways that flatly contradicted its plain historical sense. While the Affirmation argued that pluralism fostered denominational health, J. Gresham Machen countered that genuine unity required an unyielding commitment to objective truth and confessions. The publication and circulation of the Auburn Affirmation marked a permanent turning point in the internal power dynamics of mainline American Protestantism, signaling the steady erosion of conservative ecclesiastical power. From 1924 onward, voting dynamics at the annual Presbyterian General Assembly shifted definitively away from the fundamentalist coalition and their strict legislative platform. The governing body systematically overturned previous judicial and legislative rulings that had favored the conservative cause over the course of several years. Most importantly, the General Assembly dismantled the fundamentalist framework by repealing the requirement for ministers to subscribe to specific doctrines not explicitly mandated within the text of the Westminster Confession itself. The centralized testing mechanism constructed over the preceding decade was completely dismantled, leaving traditionalists without their primary tool for regulating candidates. The ultimate institutional victory of the Affirmationist perspective was formalized at the 1926 General Assembly, which officially adopted an explicit principle of tolerance mirroring the core rhetoric of the Auburn Affirmation. This administrative milestone redefined Presbyterian identity, shifting the foundational definitions used by the denomination for decades. Under this new policy, Presbyterianism was no longer defined strictly as a rigid system of uniform dogmatic belief enforced by a centralized assembly. Instead, it was legally reframed as a broad historical tradition and a controlling sentiment. The assembly declared that this sentiment inherently allowed for a wide diversity of individual views. This critical requirement was maintained provided the underlying core of truth remained identical, effectively transforming the denomination into a pluralistic institution where competing theological frameworks claimed equal validity. The symbolic and practical turning point of this institutional transition occurred at the 1925 General Assembly during the election for moderator, capturing the attention of the entire church. Charles Erdman, a moderate conservative professor from Princeton, defeated Clarence McCartney, the hardline candidate backed firmly by the fundamentalist faction. The conflict between Charles Erdman and J. Gresham Machen was particularly illuminating. Though Charles Erdman was personally orthodox, he was fully willing to cooperate with theological liberals for global evangelism. Erdman sought global mission work and denominational peace, a stance J. Gresham Machen viewed directly as a betrayal of truth. This clash exposed a deep divide regarding the essence of the faith. For J. Gresham Machen, the essence of Christianity was primarily doctrinal, requiring absolute intellectual purity and an uncompromising defense of truth at all times. For Charles Erdman, the Christian life was primarily experiential and practical, prioritizing cooperative evangelism and visible unity over dogmatic precision. This internal division among conservatives broke their resistance, acting as the direct catalyst for a major administrative reorganization of Princeton Theological Seminary. The church's central leadership dissolved the seminary's traditional conservative board of directors, replacing it with a single, unified board of trustees to ensure compliance. This move signaled the total victory of the moderate liberal alignment, appointing two prominent signers of the Auburn Affirmation to the new governing board and cementing the shift in institutional control. The institutional shift, following the adoption of the principle of tolerance, quickly translated into direct administrative action against the remaining conservative resistance. In 1929, the Presbyterian General Assembly formally investigated the ongoing controversy at Princeton Theological Seminary, placing the blame on J. Gresham Machen and his conservative faction. This structural realignment broke the institutional gridlock. and initiated a swift series of disciplinary actions targeting traditionalist leaders across the church. Through the early 1930s, the conflict transitioned from theological debates in journals to formal judicial trials within established ecclesiastical courts. J. Gresham Machen and his closest allies, having established an independent mission board to ensure financial contributions only supported Orthodox missionaries, were charged with insubordination. This intense legal battle culminated in 1936 when Gresham Machen himself was formally defrocked and stripped of his ministerial credentials within the PCUSA. From the perspective of the conservative minority, these disciplinary measures were viewed as a severe, vengeful purge designed to eliminate theological dissent entirely. They protested the severity of the actions, arguing that the punishments were entirely out of proportion to their alleged offenses against the assembly's authority. The institutional response extended far beyond stripping pastors of their credentials. It also involved the systematic seizure of local church properties by denominational authorities. In numerous instances, pastors who stood in solidarity with the conservative movement were literally locked out of their sanctuaries by judicial injunction issued by civil courts. These local congregations were forced to choose between the historic property and their theological convictions, creating painful divisions across multiple communities. Rather than crushing their resolve, this systemic pressure caused conservatives to view their experience as suffering for the sake of Christ, reframing their institutional defeat completely. They proudly embraced this institutional exile as the necessary price required to stand firm against what they openly perceived as a growing apostasy within the mainline church. The definitive break between the two factions became inevitable when the progressive and moderate alignment reorganized Princeton Theological Seminary's governing board in 1929. Unwilling to compromise their academic and theological integrity under a newly configured liberal-dominated board, J. Gresham Machen and several prominent faculty chose to leave. Joined by a significant contingent of students who shared their conviction, these professors boldly abandoned the historic campus to preserve their heritage. In the autumn of 1929, they founded Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, establishing a brand new center for orthodoxy. This new institution was established to serve as an independent bastion of historic Reformed scholasticism, completely free from administrative control and perceived compromise. In historical perspective, the Auburn Affirmation stands as a watershed moment in American Protestant history, permanently institutionalizing theological pluralism as an alternative to immediate denominational fracturing. The true brilliance of the document lay in its highly effective rhetorical strategy, which successfully delayed immediate fracturing but ultimately sowed the seeds of the denomination's long-term instability. The true brilliance of the document lay in its highly effective rhetorical strategy, which successfully reframed the terms of the entire conflict by altering the public debate, shielding modernists while setting the stage for a permanent doctrinal fragmentation. Rather than centering on whether supernatural foundations were being abandoned, this tactical sidestep reduced an existential crisis of faith into a mere dispute over organizational styles, leaving the church functionally hollowed out. The authors cast the struggle as a choice between two distinct organizational styles, an administrative mask that concealed a deeper theological erosion and ultimately costly institutional drift. The authors cast the struggle as a choice between two distinct organizational styles competing for church leadership, creating a political victory that ultimately traded theological integrity for institutional survival. They presented the conflict as a standoff between an aggressive group of traditionalists and a level-minded, peace-seeking body of moderates who merely desired to protect personal freedom and harmony. This strategic shift allowed the progressive wing to capture the moderate center, completely isolating the fundamentalists and their strict legislative demands. The historical consequences extended far beyond the credentials of individual ministers across the network. By shifting unity away from shared truths, The Affirmation transformed the meaning of a confessional church. The precedent established by the PCUSA provided a blueprint for other major American denominations, setting an administrative trend for decades to come. Across the religious landscape, the preservation of the institutional apparatus, its properties, financial assets, and cultural prestige became the primary objective, while doctrinal consensus was relegated to a secondary concern. The root cause of the current identity crisis and steady numerical decline characterizing America's largest mainline Protestant denominations can be traced directly back to these victories in the 1920s and 1930s. During that era, mainline churches consistently prioritized broad cultural influence and social relevance over deep, unyielding theological conviction within their leadership. In retrospect, the warnings issued by Gresham Machen regarding the long-term secularization of the church proved to be highly accurate over the following generations. By eroding their own dogmatic foundations to accommodate contemporary intellectual trends, mainline institutions gradually lost the unique theological voice that justified their existence. This systemic loss of unique identity and message ultimately accelerated their disconnect from the very culture they sought to influence. Ultimately, long-term outcomes reveal a striking irony for both sides. From an institutional standpoint, the independent bodies spawned by Machen's exit failed to achieve widespread cultural dominance. However, the current condition of mainline Presbyterianism, characterized by internal theological confusion, ongoing division, and diminishing social impact, demonstrates that the modernist strategy fared no better. The Auburn Affirmation successfully preserved institutional unity for a generation, but it did so by introducing an underlying pluralism that left the mainline tradition unanchored in the modern world. The legacy of the Auburn Affirmation forces us to confront the delicate balance between structural unity and doctrinal purity. When an ecclesiastical institution broadens its boundaries to accommodate cultural shifts, it must inevitably weigh what is being sacrificed in the name of peace. History demonstrates that the decisions made in the quiet halls of committee meetings eventually reshape the entire spiritual landscape for generations to come. Can a community genuinely maintain its identity when its foundational definitions of truth become entirely fluid? If the preservation of the institution requires the compromise of its core convictions, is the resulting survival a victory or a defeat? Join us next week as we step further back into history to examine another pivotal turning point in the Reformed tradition, the Great Fracture of 1857. We will dive into the deep theological, cultural, and linguistic divides that split the Dutch immigrant church, charting the intense separation of the Reformed Church in America and the Christian Reformed Church. If you want to continue exploring the fascinating intersections of church history, theology, make sure to subscribe to Theology today. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode as we unpack the ideas and controversies that shape the modern religious landscape.